So the first bit of this morning then will be talking about group skills and meetings and some ways to run meetings and participate in them and a bit about why you'd hold them and maybe sometimes why you wouldn't hold them. I obviously only bring to the table this morning personal experience of the meetings I've been in, but many of you will also have attended meetings of various levels of formality and so may well have some really good feedback to share about the topic. So if I say something and it resonates as particularly true, so you've experienced this in the real world, or if you have experienced maybe the opposite of it, then please put your hand up and share. It's a really good opportunity to learn from each other. And meetings is the sort of thing that, like, it's helpful to have a little bit of theory so that you're thinking critically about them, but really the only way to get good at running a meeting is to practice running a meeting and to participate in them as sort of thing that requires doing rather than just knowing. So meetings are used really frequently and sort of a whole range of them. So if you and your colleagues are just having a discussion together to plan a job, that's an informal meeting. They can be used to sort of present or defend points of view, particularly for policy. For you guys, often there'll be contract progress meetings. So if you're working on a project, often built into your contract will be a regular meeting schedule where you go and you report on what you've done so far or what your contractors have done so far, or if you're the project manager, people will be reporting to you. And then if you're in an organisation that's sort of more than just a couple of people big, then you'll have general staff meetings relatively often as well. And those will be sometimes whole staff meetings. So here at Polytech, twice a year we have whole staff meeting days, and then we have ABE meetings, and then we have engineering technologies meetings, and then in O Block we have maths team meetings. So they sort of range in size. And the further you advance in a company, the more meetings you're going to have to attend, and the more meetings you're probably going to have to run. Me, not that many, because I deliberately decide to do my university work pretty much whenever there's a meeting. But for people in management in the department, it's quite a lot of their time is in meetings and in organising. For people who are lecturing, it's a lot less, but still quite a lot. So it's an important kind of balance to think about, and we'll talk a bit more about it in a tick. So the further you advance, often the more meetings you need to attend. So when you're a manager, instead of just attending a meeting occasionally to say what you've been doing, you now have to attend meetings to hear from everybody else what they've been doing and decide on policy and things. So if you really hate meetings, it's worth thinking about when you're applying for particular jobs, what sort of extent your job's going to rely on you going to them. So here are some of the things we'll talk about. So first of all, why we hold them. So present ideas, solve problems. Like we talked about last week with the business correspondence, often if you're trying to solve a problem or trying to do something that requires a lot of back and forwards of information, then just sending a letter or an email and then having them reply and then you replying again isn't always great. It may well be easier to just have a meeting and talk face to face, particularly if you've got quite a few people that need to be involved in the conversation. So you can share information, and then often again it's just as part of a contractual fulfillment. And sometimes there are too many meetings or unnecessary meetings in an institution. So it's worth thinking about, if you're thinking about holding a meeting, about if there's another way that this conversation could happen effectively. And sometimes the answer will be yes, and sometimes it will be no. But part of the harm of having too many meetings is that they're really expensive in terms of capital and time, and also the goodwill of participants. So by the time you gather everybody, if you have 10 people attending a meeting and it lasts an hour, that's 10 hours that your organisation is paying for people to attend a meeting. So you want to make sure that you get that sort of value out of the meeting. It's often also, if you've got people who are travelling off-site to supervise jobs and things, and there's a meeting like in the middle of the morning, often for them the reality is that it means that they don't go to the site for basically the whole morning. So they don't just lose an hour on site, they lose much more than that. So it's worth thinking about those sort of timing issues that people might face. And it can cost what we're calling goodwill. So if it's not necessary and people kind of have to go to a meeting that they don't really need to be at, and it's not well run, or there's not decisions or progress made, then people can become a bit fed up with the meetings and can either be reluctant to attend future meetings, even though they might be useful, or just feel generally sort of unhappy at work, which is not great. So if you're calling meetings, you want to make sure that you're not doing them more often than necessary, and that there's actually something constructive that the meeting can achieve. There's a real range of meetings. So like we talked about, if you're just having sort of a fairly informal meeting with your colleagues, you probably don't even really think of it as a meeting. You're just in the office and you're making a plan about how you're going to tackle a certain project. It is a work meeting, but it's fairly informal. And then obviously there's much more formal meetings, so you sort of go right up to like Parliament and court, where everything's very formal, there's very set rules. Most meetings that you'll be involved in will happen somewhere in the middle. So in a business or in a work context, you'll be in a meeting where there are some rules and procedures and expectations of behaviour, but maybe not incredibly formal ones. So today, we're going to talk about those sort of in the middle meetings and how you can run them and then have a practice at running some group meetings. So it's really important that you know the rules of the meeting you're in. And they can be written or unwritten, and it kind of depends on how formal they are. So there's some lists of rules there, but usually rules will be organisation specific. And if you're in a really high up position, so say if you're on a board of directors for a company, then your meetings may well be governed by slightly more formal rules. So if you're going to make a policy decision or change the constitution of a company, then there'll be rules around what majority have to vote for that to happen, or rules around when voting has to be anonymous ballot and when it can just be an aye vote and things. So there'll be, usually if it's important, there'll be formal written rules, and if it's less formal, the rules will be unwritten, but there'll still be cultural expectations about within your organisation about how meetings are run. So take a couple of minutes now, just turn to the people next to you and come up with 5 rules or guidelines that you think are probably good general guidelines for meetings. So in a semi-formal meeting environment, what are some good rules? So we'll start in the front. What was one of your suggestions?
One person speaks /
Okay, so one person talking / respect each other. Good. Over here? Time management, so run the meeting efficiently. Yeah. Good. At the back, was it just one giant group at the back or 2 groups? Okay, good. Giant group at the back, one rule? Yeah, okay, so like stick to the topic. Yeah, you can chat in your own time. It's a very formal boss over there. Good. Over here? Minutes. Yep, taking minutes, keeping a record. Fantastic. Out the front. Anything else? Pardon? Yep. Trying to organise them well. You got to be quieter. Over here. Okay, so come prepared. So if you are expected to offer something, make sure you're prepared. Particularly probably if you're the person that's running the meeting, make sure you're organised. Otherwise the meeting's going to be a bit ad hoc. Out the back. Yep. 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 Do you hear? Make sure your hair's good. That's all right. It's all in here. There. On this side. Okay, so the minimum amount of people, so you don't want to bring in a lot of people who aren't really relevant to the meeting. At the same time, it's often quite a good idea if you let people sort of self-select as to whether or not an issue affects them, if you're having quite a general discussion at the meeting so they feel involved. But you're right, if you're really trying to get some progress on things and having the minimum people is good, and extra people will either not participate at all or participate counterproductively because they're not that involved. But you want to be careful that you don't exclude people who are going to, you don't want to exclude people who are going to feel offended or affronted by that, or who are going to be affected by the policy and not get a say. Oh, okay. Yeah, so sorry. So, okay, yeah, so you have to have a certain number of people to get across the threshold to make it worthwhile. Okay, sorry. But also, you don't want to have meetings with a million extra people. Yeah, there you go. So I've just suggested my own one in there at the front again. Anything else? Yeah, so keep records, make a summary. Usually you elect a secretary who will talk about soon to send those records around so that everyone gets there. Yep. Okay, yep, so that they know what they're talking about before they get there, rather than just be like, hey, there's a meeting. Good, out the back. Yep, that's good. So we'll talk a bit about bias, so gender bias is important, but there could be other sorts of bias as well. So particularly race bias, or just in general, there's usually in a workplace some people who are really happy to talk and offer opinions and don't feel intimidated at all, and some people who are a bit more reserved. So in meetings, it's important that you get participation from as many people as possible. So thinking about bias is really important. Or if you're people who are out on the site have lots to talk about, but people that are back at the office have less, you want to make sure you sort of balance out and give everyone an opportunity to talk. Anything else over here? Yep, have someone chairing the meeting, absolutely. If somebody's not in charge, chances of the meeting being productive and all those other things go down the front. Yep, okay, so if you have to make a decision by a certain time, yep, make sure it's done. Good, yeah. You guys are good. Do you guys have a new one, or are you done? Pardon? Eliminated? That's all right, you did well. Group at the back, what do you got? Go, Jesse. Yep. So being constructive in your attitude. So particularly often you'll be having meetings, listening guys, where maybe one group of people are underperforming, or a particular contractor is maybe underperforming. And if you're having a meeting where you're trying to solve a problem like that, having an attitude where you're sort of condescending to them or dismissive of them will probably sort of just drag the problem out. So yeah, making sure your attitude is professional will be really helpful. Over here, got anyone else? Anything else? Pardon? No cell phone usage? Yep. So we'll talk in a minute about cell phones, but you're right. So in general, the rule is have your cell phone off or on vibrate in your pocket. Sometimes, in reality, in the workplace, you might be in the middle of something else, and you might be expecting a really important call, during Friday morning. So if you're at a meeting on Friday morning and you know that you're going to get a call from a contractor at some point that you need to take, you can just say at the start of the meeting, if this call comes through, I'll need to take it, and I'll leave the room at that point, just so people know that that's a possibility. So it's just called declaring your cell phone. But if that's not the case, then probably off. So you're not playing Candy Crush, or you're not Snapchatting during your meetings, even if it's very boring. But yeah, so and it's a respect thing, and it's about engaging. So it's really good. Up the front. Yep, so food and drink during the meetings. Yep. So often after meetings, listening guys, there'll be foods and nibbles. Sometimes there'll be like a cup of tea or coffee during the meeting, depends sort of how long it is and things. But yeah, you're not going to bring your lunch often to a work meeting, sort of sit and eat noisily. But it depends again. We had a student once, just on a side note, try and turn up to sit a drawing exam in the fancy drawing room with his like Big Mac combo, and just in terms of like inappropriate places to bring food. And it was like loud and smelly, and he was so confused why he couldn't just eat it during the exam. Yeah, so probably don't bring your Big Mac combo to your meetings or obviously to your exams. Cool, so yeah, so thinking about appropriate food and drink. Down the back. Yep. Okay, yeah, that's... Yeah. Yeah. So if it's a shouty meeting, make sure you shout. If it's not, make sure you... Yeah. So often meetings start off as non-shouty meetings and then become shoutier. And usually when people are shouting or getting really heated, the chance of finding a productive answer to what you're talking about kind of goes down because people lose a bit of their sort of cool, calm and collectedness and get a bit angrier. So I've been in meetings where the chairperson of the meeting has, in my opinion, and other people might think differently, left too much scope for people to just list things that are annoying them. And so a lot of people in the meeting just list a whole bunch of stuff that annoys them and got really quite angry about it all, and then just sort of like yelled at each other for a little bit, and then just nothing really happened. So shouty meetings tend to be fairly unproductive, but you do want to just think about, if it's a very quiet, calm meeting, you don't necessarily want to be the one that's having to yell at everybody else. Got one over here? Or are we out? Okay, so think about the venue. Yep, so the size of the room you're meeting in is really important. If it's a small meeting, you don't want a huge empty space. If you're expecting lots of people, you don't want to like jam them in like little sardines. Also, though, you want people to be able to see and hear each other. So if you're in a room with lots of people and there's like columns in the middle, so some people can't see each other, it can be a real pain. Good, at the front. Okay, yeah. It's really good. So finishing the meeting with something that makes people feel good about it. So summarizing in a way that people are like, yep, we accomplished something, and sending them out. That's a good tactic. It's very tactical. I like it. Down the back, and then we might have to stop. You guys are going to...
Leave your emotional issues in your office.
Yep. Yep. And know what? No pets at the meeting. Yeah. Okay, so unless you need a assistance dog or something, then leave your pets in your office also. Cool, listening back in. But it's quite a good point about leaving emotional issues at the office. So, and it sounds sort of, It sounds pretty straightforward, but in reality, often at work, there'll be people who you get on with well and people who really rub you the wrong way. And if you approach meetings with that sort of baggage, you're less likely to be able to conduct yourself professionally and get a good outcome out of the meeting. So you want to be able to separate, sort of have two hats almost. So separate out those emotional things and what you need to be doing at the meeting. Okay, cool, really good. So the key ones, which you guys absolutely covered, are around cell phones and the etiquette around that. So we talked about it being declared. So if you need to take a call during the meeting, warn people in advance, or on off or silent mode. Keeping comments impersonal. So that was the stuff about leaving your emotions sort of out of things, about making sure your language is appropriate, about using constructive language, particularly if you're trying to problem solve around dealing with an individual or a company that's underperforming. You don't want your meeting to be like a personal attack on them, because while that might make you feel less bitter at the time, it's unlikely to result in a good outcome. So just like with when we were writing the correspondence, if you were making a complaint, you want to keep it fairly factual and impersonal. And then being respectful, so not talking over each other. The best way to get everyone to participate is to set a tone where people aren't talking over each other, where everybody gets an opportunity to speak. So some of the roles of people at the meeting, and you've talked about all of these in your rules, so this is really good. So you have a meeting leader, and they're usually called a chairperson or a facilitator. If it's a formal meeting where you're going to have to make decisions, it'll be a chairperson. If it's a meeting where you're trying to gauge people's opinion about things, it'll probably just be a facilitator, but they do basically the same thing. So usually it's the most senior person present, unless they're unable to be neutral in that meeting because, like management is trying to say we have to do this thing, in which case that senior person from management is probably not going to be very neutral. But usually it's the most senior person present, and often it'll rotate. So if you're in a group and you meet regularly, you may rotate chairperson. So the chairperson is there to facilitate the meeting rather than advocate for their particular position. And their job is keeping order, making sure everyone stays focused, making sure everybody is participating, and getting a decision made if there needs to be one made, Jesse. Yeah, if you assigned a chairperson, then write that. If you didn't, then do it the next time you have a meeting and put it in your log B. But yeah, so certainly in your log A, if you did stuff like assigned a chairperson or somebody took minutes, then record that. Yep. So it just entitles a person who normally is elected in, who does this job, who calls the meeting to order, who instructs people when it's their turn to talk. If there's formal rules, so if you're in a meeting where there's rules around who's allowed to vote or what sort of vote you have to take, or around we have to assign scrutineers to count anonymous ballots, then your chairperson makes sure that those procedures are followed, and that's their responsibility. No. So if everyone in the meeting sits and talks and nobody's sort of guiding the meeting will very quickly move away from what you need to do. It'll sort of, like it would be very uncommon for a meeting without a chairperson to come up with a constructive outcome. So the chairperson doesn't need to be as formal, like depending on the type of meeting. So the chairperson in the meetings that we'll be running today, you're going to elect a chairperson for each meeting. And that their job is, even in a fairly informal meeting, is keeping order and ensuring focus and making sure everyone gets a fair say. And when you give that responsibility to someone, it means there's a person who is consciously thinking about those things. Whereas if nobody has that responsibility, it's unlikely that everybody in the group is consciously trying to make sure those things are happening. And so it's not going to be as productive. You should still have a chairperson for the meeting. So it doesn't have to be like a super formal election. It'll probably be, in that instance, the person that called the meeting, because you still need somebody who you've all agreed has the authority to say, you've talked enough, now it's somebody else's turn, or now we need to move on, or now we need to make a decision. And so as a group, you should agree to give somebody that authority. So I mean, like, obviously in real life, I'm not going to attend every meeting you go to and force you to elect a chairperson, but from my experience of meetings, having somebody who is nominally in charge of the meeting, who may have to do a lot of work if the meeting's tending to get really distracted or people aren't participating well, or who may have to do not very much work at all if people are really on track, but having that person is really, really important. Okay, so a meeting leader, you have a secretary who takes the minutes and emails those minutes around after meetings normally, and reinforces action lists. So we'll talk a bit about an action list when we talk about minutes. But basically, it's a method of taking minutes where you record so-and-so was going to do X by this date. That's kind of like the important bit that comes out of a meeting often. So the secretary will send that around and then email people to make sure it's happening. And often we'll set dates for the following meeting. And if you need to email people outside of your organisation between meetings, often that'll be the secretary will do that. So depending on the type of institution you're in, the role will be slightly different. So if you're, often the secretary will just take the notes and send them around, and you'll have, you might allocate the external correspondence out to individuals, or you might have an admin support team who provide people that come and do minutes and manage correspondence. It really depends on where you are. I think this one was up first. Yep.
Would it be sexist to say that a secretary is generally a woman? Because I've been to a lot of meetings and like 99% of the time they're women.
Yeah, so even if there's only like one woman in the meeting, usually they get allocated the job of secretary, right? Just because of traditional gender roles. So I've been the secretary of many things, even though I'm not particularly good at remembering to do things and am actually quite a rubbish secretary. So I think, yes, traditionally, often women are the secretary, but you should try and not be limited in your thinking and just judge who's going to be good based on their gender, and rather consider who's good at taking notes and contacting people. But yeah, often it does go to the woman, but I don't think that's necessarily a great thing. Sometimes, if it's not a very, if you if you want to hold all the power, if it's not a very big or very formal meeting, then that will probably be fine. If it is a very formal meeting, so sometimes it's really important that you record like who moves a motion and who seconds it and who votes what, and a lot of those details. So if it's a more formal meeting, you want a separate person whose only job is to be recording what's happening, because otherwise if you're trying to do that and call for nominations and do other things, it's sort of too much at once. But certainly, like, it's entirely possible that somebody could chair a meeting and take minutes if it's not a very formal meeting. But those two roles still need to happen. Cool. Other secretarial questions? Often the secretary works quite closely with the treasurer if you're in an organisation where you have a treasurer, or the secretary will work quite closely with the administration team if you're in an organisation with one of them. So a treasurer is somebody that manages the money. So if you're in an organisation, so at work, usually there'll be an admin team that do it. If you're having meetings for other groups you're involved in, then there may well be a treasurer. And often the position is joint, because if you can write letters, you can also do bank accounts, apparently. Cool. Other questions? Cool. And then the other key people at meetings are participants. So if you are not the chairperson of the meeting or the secretary and you haven't been assigned a specific role for the meeting, you are still required to actively participate in it. So you're there for a purpose, especially if the meeting is well organised and hasn't called in a whole bunch of people that they don't need. So you need to contribute and do something, unless you're told that you're just there to observe a meeting, which would be a very rare occurrence. So you should, as you're talking about in your rules before, prepare and bring information or have an opinion to share. You need to be ready to outline your point of view, and you need to participate helpfully in discussing what the course of action should be as a result of the meeting. Okay, so even if you're just there as yourself, not in sort of a really formal capacity, you need to be doing something. The other thing you should be doing is just keeping some personal notes. They obviously don't need to be as detailed as the secretary's notes, but things that will matter to you. So something that will affect you, or if you volunteer to do something or are volunteered by somebody else to do something, you should write down as a way of, like, just a useful way of staying engaged with the meeting. Especially if it's long, you can sometimes like get a bit sleepy, but also just to help you remember what's going on. Okay, so even if it's you, then be participating. Okay. So like we've sort of alluded to, there's lots of different types of decision making that can happen in meetings, and it can be really formal or really informal. So if it's a formal decision making process, there will be written rules that will be given to you beforehand about, so if you're doing things like if you're nominating people for formal positions like presidents or of unions and things, there'll be a formal nomination process and a formal voting process. If you're making binding decisions about things, there'll probably be a formal voting process where some decisions are made just by putting your hand up, and some are made by like secret ballot. I've voted both ways in meetings. It just depends on what your organisation is and what the rules are. So just be aware of those. Particularly if you're the chairperson, you need to know those rules really well, because if you don't run the meeting according to those rules, then the decisions made at the meeting may or may not be valid. So if you need a certain majority to pass a thing, then you need to make sure you've got it. Often in your business meetings, though, it'll just sort of be a consensus decision-making process. So we sort of ended up at this point, and that was our decision, and we gave people these jobs. And sometimes you don't even really need a decision if it's just a meeting to keep everybody in touch with each other. But usually there'll be something that you need to achieve at the meeting. So different decision-making documents. Okay. And then the documents associated with your meeting, a notice of meeting, an agenda, and minutes. And the notice of meeting, again, can be really formal or not that formal. So basically, it's letting people know what the meeting's about, who's expected to be there, when the meeting is, where the meeting is. It's giving people that information to attend. So if it's a pretty informal meeting, you can send around an email letting people know, or lots of institutions have like a calendar application where you book a meeting in the calendar and it sends out invitations to people. So that sort of system. Again, if it's a more formal meeting, you may have to hold, give a notice of meeting to the public or to your organisation. If that's the case, then again, there'll just be written rules about it. So you'll find yourself, if you're moving up in an organisation, having to become familiar with those rules, and that'll give you the notice of meeting stuff. So on the notice of meeting, it's just got what the meeting's going to be about, who's expected to be there, and where it is and when it is. Basic information. Okay, and then on the back is an agenda. So an agenda is basically a more detailed list of what's going to be discussed at the meeting. Sometimes it's useful to circulate that before the meeting if there's things that you want people to be able to prepare for, or if it's like a general meeting and you want people to be able to bring their own agenda items, then circulating the agenda before the meeting is really good. Otherwise, you can often just outline it at the meeting. It's just a way of structuring the meeting. It will be. So agendas, again, just need that basic information at the top about who's, what the meeting is, where it is, when it is, who is at it, so that you can identify that meeting exactly, and then sort of the list of things that are happening. And often the agenda will form kind of a template for the minutes. Yep, listening team? So the agenda will often form a template for the minutes. So if you're the secretary and you're taking the minutes, and there's an agenda already in front of you that lists the points that you're going to go through and in what order, then that's quite a good template usually. So your minutes can come sort of in a range of ways. So the notice of meeting, you just need that information that we talked about, and you can just email it or put it on a notice board usually. The agenda, again, needs that information that lets you work out exactly what meeting the agenda is referring to. And you can either email it early or hand it out at the meeting. And then the minutes can happen in a couple of different ways. So you can either take what's called verbatim minutes, which says either every word spoken, or so-and-so said this, and then so-and-so agreed, and this person disagreed, and have a lot of detail. Usually for you guys, it won't be necessary to take minutes in that much detail, but it depends. Again, if it's a very formal meeting, then that information could be really important. Usually, you'll probably take the discussion and decision minutes. So the meeting talked about this, here's what was decided. So sort of a topic decision format as a record. Probably for your log A. I don't imagine, again, it's up to you. So log A is just about you practicing things for yourself. We don't care too much how you do it. But I don't imagine verbatim minutes would be that useful for your group meetings. And then the other type of minutes is action points. So usually you'd use a combination of the decision, discussion, and then put your action points in. Sometimes all that's necessary is the action point. So action points just means this person will be doing this by this date. This person will be doing this by this date. Just as a way of making a note of all the commitments in the meeting, and then that's what you send around. So usually you'd have a little bit of record about, we talked about this, here's what we decided. this person's going to email the people concerned. Yep, Jesse? So same question we had just before. So probably for you guys, that discussion, decision, action points is about right. I don't think it's going to be that useful for you to have really detailed verbatim minutes. So you just want to have a quick thing about, we talked about, these possible topics, and we decided that this person would do that, this person would do whatever. So the minimum that you want in minutes from any meeting is those action points, as a record of what people are going to do as a result of the meeting. And then you probably want a little more information about the meeting, which is that discussion decision. Yep. Pretty sure it says on the assessment. So you want to put it in my Dropbox or Joelle's Dropbox, which are over in O Block. So either of those will be fine. Okay. So yeah, so in general, the action points is kind of the minimum. You don't want to have a meeting and then nobody writes anything down and nobody follows up on anything. So it's really easy when you go to a meeting, you say you'll do something, and then you get back to your office and you forget about it completely, unless somebody emails stuff around. And then you have at the next meeting, you're like, oh yeah, I thought somebody was going to do that, but nobody can remember who, and then nothing really happens. So the minimum is those action points, but you probably want a little bit of discussion information in there too. Okay? Okay. So the minutes should, again, have that sort of place setting information. So the organisation, when the meeting happened, some record of discussion, the contact name of the person who took the minutes, when the minutes were written up, and then an action column or action points. And you can email that or post it around. But it's good to send that to people who were at the meeting. Okay, so here's an example of minutes that are basically verbatim minutes. So Smith did this, and Jones and Browns and White did this. It's like quite a lot of detail. You probably don't need that much. So I would, in just taking this minute, write discussion around insufficient car parking, agreed that the matter should be raised with head office, Smith to action before the end of the month. So we talked about this, here's what we decided, here's what somebody's going to do about it. It's probably going to be enough. Okay. There was a hand up, it's gone down again. Depends on the organisation, doesn't matter too much. Like, again, if it's a very formal meeting, then last names might be more appropriate. If it's not particularly formal, first names might be fine. It'll just be an institutional thing. For these logs, first names is absolutely fine. Okay. So during meetings, you want to stay focused. You want to take personal notes, and then think as well. Learn from others. If there's somebody at the meeting that's doing something particularly helpful or unhelpful, you want to either replicate that or not replicate it. Just think about how you're participating. And you want to perform your role. So if you're the chairperson, you need to make sure that the meeting is well structured and people are participating helpfully. If you're the secretary, you need to make sure that you're keeping an accurate record of what's going on. And if you're a participant, you need to make sure that you are participating constructively. If you attend a meeting and you sit there and you don't really say anything and you don't really do anything, then in my opinion, you kind of divulge your ability to complain about the outcome of that meeting later. If you're not part of the process, then you don't really get to then critique the outcome at a later date. So you need to make sure that you're contributing actively and being helpful in the workplace. So usually people call meetings because they need the input of other people to come up with a good solution for something. So participate in that.